Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Azmi Bishara.
Thank you for waiting so long. I'm really sorry, it was traffic at every junction. I left my home like about an hour ago. Okay, of course, I'm here to answer a question, a question of two parts. Did democracy lose this round and why? Of course, I'm afraid the answer for the longer part of the question is the shorter answer. The answer is yes, it lost. But I will dwell on the shorter part, and I don't think I'll be able to answer it in a comprehensive way. I will try to give some aspects of a possible answer of the question, why did it lose in the Arab world? Of course, things in the West are making the issue more complicated now, because many people in the Arab world would tell us it's failing in its home of origin. At least liberalism is failing somehow. It's not making life easier for us, we Arab liberal Democrats now, to defend liberal democracy at these difficult times. Anyway, we're speaking, our departure will be from 2011, when young people went out to the streets to shout against, or to protest at least against what they call corruption and despotism. And it was actually a protest movement that found itself a revolution. I think they discovered that they are a revolution a little late, a few days after they started, when they started shouting for regime change. Because we did not have any planned revolutions for democracy in the Arab world. This is the truth. We had actually very massive protest movements of young people, a new generation, who is sharing more values than ideologies. This is different between that generation and my generation, who protested in the 60s and the 70s. We were moved by ideologies. They are moved more by moral values. This is a very important progress that we made. It's a generational progress, actually. Anyway, these were protest movements. As I see them as protest movements, in general, you can articulate it, at least in Egypt and Syria, in Tunisia, where the spark happened, against, I would put it in short, against humiliation for human dignity, which is the weakest side of tyranny. And I started lately using tyranny, not despotism, because despotism could be enlightened somehow, at least as Voltaire thought in the 18th century. But tyranny cannot be enlightened. So I will use from now on word tyranny. We did not have any enlightened despotism in the Arab world in the last few decades. Now, these protest movements found themselves, or discovered that they are actually a revolution by shouting for regime change. And it happened in two countries where the presidents abdicated, in Tunisia and in Egypt. And the young people went out to the streets, actually protesting torture and humiliation, physical abuse of human beings, thought that they can conclude that they actually achieved or finished the job when Mr. Mubarak and Mr. Zain al-Abidin resigned or abdicated. Now, in such circumstances where you don't have a democratic revolution with a democratic party, which is actually very rare in the world that you have a democratic revolution. Actually, it never happens. You have revolutions, not democratic revolutions. Democracy happens afterwards through reform, not through revolutions. This includes the French Revolution. The French revolutions did not lead to democracy at the beginning. It needed a long, long process of reform to reach democracy at the end. So actually, this was a revolution, or a protest movement that turned into a revolution and delivered the mission, as it happens in such cases in different parts of the world, to the political elites to see what they can make out of it. The political elites of the opposition and the ruling elites. Usually you have roundtables after such events, or long bargaining processes by elites to accept or to agree on rules of the game, how they can continue. In the Arab world, and here I start with the first issue, they did not agree. They couldn't reach a compromise concerning the rules of the game. And I'm speaking about the Arab political elites, opposition, and the ruling elites. The young people thought they did the job, they finished, they went back home, and they gave it further to the political elites to agree on a path, on a way to get rid of despotism or of tyranny. In certain cases, the young people demanded democracy. I can give examples if you want. They demanded democracy and articulated, they raised it specifically. They called for democracy. But they did not have a plan for democracy. And you can't impose it like you impose an ideology when you occupy power, when you take power, as it happened in the Bolshevik Revolution or the Iranian Revolution or even the French Revolution. It should happen as a process afterwards. What we discovered, and I can summarize in very short, that the Arab political elite had no democratic culture. This is very important, including the oppositional elites. In my book in 2007, The Arab Question, I dedicated a whole chapter to the issue of political culture. It was a very important debate at the beginning of the first decade of this century, also in the 90s, the issue of political culture, how important it is in democratic transition, and how important it was in the so-called Arab exceptionalism. Is it a cultural question? Is it Islam? Is it Arab ideology? What is it exactly? People discussed a lot the issue of what we call today political culture. My opinion was in 2007, and I wrote it, published it, that it's not true. People do not have democratic cultures before democracy. I mean people, masses of people. I mean the people. And I brought examples from Eastern Europe, from Germany, from Italy, from some South American countries where democratization happened in the so-called third wave. Before a time could pass where people were democratized. I don't think the German people after Nazism had time to democratize. Democracy was agreed upon by the political elites. And then you democratize people, it's a long process by education and other ways. Today we have a negative proof, or an opposite proof to what I said. When we look at the political culture in the Midwest, in the United States, or in parts of France today, etc., these are countries of democracy, and discover that the political culture of the people is not very different from the political culture of our people. But democracy is not decided this way. It's an issue of political systems and political elites. Our problem was not our people. People don't mind not to be arrested without a reason, not to be tortured, not to be humiliated. They don't mind that. They, of course, would welcome. The problem was the political elites. So this is the first factor. This is the first component of the question, which is not totally theoretical. It poses, or it presents some practical missions for the future. We Arab Democrats, where do we have to concentrate? What do we have to do? It's not only a theoretical exercise. This is a very important. If this hypothesis is right, some missions should be deduced out of it. Where do we have to do in the next period? Because as you can estimate, my answer is this round of democracy failed, not democracy failed. So there will be another round, and we will have to be prepared for it, of course. So this is the first mission. Second, I think that the issue of political Islamic movements cannot be neglected anymore as a marginal issue, and not in the way some of the Orientalists think, that this is the main obstacle, the main hindrance for democracy. We did discover in the hard times we passed through, actually, since 2011, that the issue of principles of democracy, so-called meta-constitutional principles or principles of democracy, is an important issue, is a crucial issue. We always knew that democracy in itself is not only majority rule, it's not only a question of the ballots, it's not even a question of free elections. It is also an issue of principles of democracy that nowadays, I believe, they overlap with the issue of liberalism. You know, we differentiate in the political theory between liberalism and democracy as two different things. We spoke about democracy in Athens. This was not a liberal place at all. And the difference between democracy in Athens and the communitarian democracy of how we imagine it today in tribes, etc., wasn't so big, actually. The issue was not the rights of the individual or the citizen, but his affiliation or her affiliation. There was no her, his affiliation to the group, to the community, the so-called Athenian community at that time. This was the major issue from which you derive rights. Rights were not bound to the individual as an individual, but to the group, to the fact that you belong to Athens. Actually, it's a kind of a tribal democracy. It's there is no way that we can connect this with liberalism. On the other hand, liberalism was not always democratic. Usually it wasn't democratic. Because liberals of the 19th century were usually elitists who did not believe that the mass of the people should have a share, should have a say in the public affairs. People who are educated, people who have values, people who have property, who pay taxes, who have responsibility on the public sphere, should have a say in the public sphere. Usually enlightened people should have. And they should care for the rights of the individual, even if these individuals do not vote. So the private sphere, freedom, liberty, wasn't totally connected with the issue of democracy. The fact that a citizen must have a say or should have a say in the public affairs of his or her country. I believe that liberalism and democracy were connected together after the Second World War, actually. That Western countries became liberal democratic countries, not either liberal or democratic. So it's a late development. It's not so old development. But now when we speak about principles of democracy that should be respected by the majority, we actually mean liberal rights. We actually mean civil liberties. And here is the problem of political Islamic movement. They democratized only in one sense, in the sense of accepting the rules of the game, accepting to go to ballots, accepting to use elections as a tool. This was a development. They did not always accept elections. They did not always accept parliamentarism. So they accepted that But we were never so sure if they accepted the principles of democracy, to respect them when they are in the majority. We mean civil liberties and sensitivity also to issues of freedom. I think the Islamic movements in general, even the mainstream in the Islamic movement, which was never a revolutionary force, which usually believed in reform and gradual change by Islamizing society, which is the Islamic Brotherhood. Even this mainstream in the Islamic movement underestimated how important liberties are for the so-called new Arab middle class, without which you cannot build anything. You will lose the cities and you will have only the countryside with you. And that's what happened in Egypt. They lost Alexandria and Cairo, actually. They didn't have no majority in them. And they lost the faith of the middle classes, who, on the other hand, were ready to implore the military to get involved and decide the dispute for them, to decide the conflict for them. We began by an Islamic movement who underestimated the issue of freedom and wasn't ready to respect the principles of democracy, not only the majority rule. We ended by knowing that the secular elites were also undemocratic. They were ready to use the army against their rivals. The issue of the Islamic movement is going to be a crucial issue, and Islamic movements in the future, as I said, in the next round of democratic transformation, have to decide on these questions. Without this decision, and without this mental change or cultural change, call it whatever you like, ideological change even, there will be no allies of the Islamic movement in the future, especially after ISIS, where ISIS drove this culture to its last end, to its last consequence. And I think there is a repulsion in wide circles of the population from the issue of religion and politics, especially in the middle class, which is actually the main popular base for democratic transition. The third issue had to do with the Arab East, more than the Arab West. Places like Tunisia actually were saved from it, which is the multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian, multicultural structure of the societies that was politicized. And the politicization of this separation, let me call them these identities, these subnational identities, if I want to be accurate, did not happen because of traditions and because of inheriting certain sensitivities from the past. Of course, they are there, but there are new phenomena that have to do with the modern state, not with the Arab culture. The attempt to mobilize loyalty, to mobilize political loyalty to non-democratic ruling regimes by using subnational affiliation, repoliticized sects, identities, ethnicities, tribes, etc., in a way that we did not know in the past. Of course, we knew sectarianism, but political sectarianism, which is exploiting these lines of identities in the struggle to control the state, is a new phenomenon. We had it in a very extreme way in Syria, where a regime wasn't from the beginning sectarian. It not only wasn't sectarian from the beginning, it was a secular regime. And some writers lately wrote, like Goldsmith, about that. I totally disagree with them, that Hafiz al-Assad reached power because of Khalduni Asabiyya, like, this fanaticism, this affiliation to to the Alawi sect that brought him to power. Actually, on the contrary, with this, he wouldn't have reached power at all. He reached power because of a party which did not look at him as a Alawi. Because of the hegemony of a sectarian nationalist Arab ideology, he reached power. But then, while in power, the sectarian affiliation was used to mobilize support, to consolidate, to enhance support from the region where he comes from, exactly what Saddam Hussein did, who was not a Sunni sectarian. He was an Arab secular nationalist. But the readiness to use this affiliation to mobilize loyalty against rivals in the same party or in the same military repoliticize these identities, and the oppressed people tended to understand that they are oppressed because of their identities. This is the victimization process, that you start calling memories from the past and reinterpret them and creating what we call now a sectarian discourse, reproducing it, actually inventing it. People who believe that they are victims, actually they always were victims, and the others were always oppressors. So actually history itself becomes sectarianized in a way that it wasn't in the past, because states that like they exist now did not exist in the past. So this was the third component, the third problem that we have. Politicizing sectarianism in the Arab world polarized the people and turned pluralism into polarization of politics of identities. You can't build democracy on this kind of pluralism, or polarization, actually, not pluralism. Of course, I can speak long about this issue because exactly these times I'm writing a whole book about the issue of sectarianization of the Arab East. But I have to force myself to stop. The fourth issue has to do with the military and its political ambitions. This is an issue that wasn't nearly solved in the Arab world because of the way the Arab countries, the Arab states emerged after colonialism and after the long Ottoman era, and after colonialism, which built actually the modern Arab armies. The Arab states emerged when the most organized and modern part of the bureaucracy was the army, actually. And this was the place where actually ideologies in the 50s and the 60s spread so easily among young officers who had political ambitions, who felt that this is the only force that can bring reform to society against what they thought are feudal, corrupted elites who lost in Palestine in 1948, who could not solve the agrarian issue. And usually they tended to think and to spread the idea that the problem are these traditional elites or their sons, the sons of the Arab nobilities who studied in Western universities and came back to rule the Arab countries, and who could not solve any important issue. They had a parliamentary system, but actually exclusive for 7% of the population or 8% of the population. And the Arab peasants lived like slaves, as they described. In the 50s, the agrarian issue was never solved. We should not underestimate also the failure in the struggle for Palestine in 1948. So actually nationalism was used. Anyway, since that time and until now, we still live the issue of politicization of the military in the Arab world, with certain differences from one country to the other. In the case of Syria and Iraq, as you know, the military ran the country for a time until it was subdued to a political party by politicizing the military itself and turning the loyalty to the party as the major ideology inside the army itself. In some other cases, like Egypt, the army achieved a kind of autonomy before 2011 and reached a kind of political deal, historical political deal with President Mubarak after it was actually marginalized by Sadat. After a long fight at the era of Nasser between the military and the presidency, Sadat succeeded to marginalize the army. Mubarak re-needed the army again to oppress political opposition, especially the so-called revolt of the internal security, al-Amn al-Markazi events, the central security forces event. He needed the army again at the time of Abu Ghazali. And they reached actually a historical compromise where the army was granted autonomy to run its own affairs and to run its own economy. So a new public sector was emerged in Egypt, which is private public sector, a public sector that is private property of the army, of the leadership of the army. Anyway, this compromise held for a time, was sustained for a time until 2011, when the army thought that there was an opportunity reinforced by the inability of the elites to reach a bargain, like I said, after the revolution of 2011. So the army thought again that it can play the savior role, and this time not to have autonomy, but to own the whole state, to own the whole public sector. And there was the military coup in a state where there were no coups since 1952. In Syria and Iraq, let me take Syria because Iraq is a totally different development. If we take Syria, since 2011 there was a revolution, but the army did no coup, although Syria is the country of military coups. This cannot be understood without the third question that I discussed, which is loyalties through sectarianism inside the army itself. Now, the change in the Arab armies since the 50s, of course, made it also difficult for young officers to create a military movement, ideological military movement inside the army, and then a coup that they later call it a revolution. First, because the armies became much bigger than they were. You cannot move a huge army or turn it upside down by a group of 15, 20, 300 officers, like the Ba'athis were. So you have large armies now, especially after the oil boom in the 70s and the ability of Arab countries to build huge armies. Second, because of the so-called military intelligence apparatus. In these Arab countries, the military intelligence is not made to spy on the enemy, but to spy on the officers in the army. This is a new creation, which is a huge organization, a very important organization, that prevents the possibility of people organizing as a young officer, organizing the so-called free officers, for example, to start a coup against the regime. Third, the political life. The free officers of the 50s and the 60s were raised in a political atmosphere, in a very vibrant political atmosphere of the liberalism between the two world wars and the first half of the 50s, where you had free parliamentary movement, for example, in 1954 in Syria. There was a very vibrant political life, and young political officers were raised in this atmosphere, and they could be politicized, a lot of ideology, Islamic ideology, nationalist ideology, leftist ideology. The new officers are raised in a totally different atmosphere of despotism, where there is no freedom to spread ideologies the way it was between the two world wars and in the 50s. So now, it's not surprising that the people who did the coup in Egypt are not the young officers, but the army itself. It's not young officers in the army who can make a coup anymore in the Arab world, but it is the leadership of the army itself that can give an order to the whole army. Totally different kind of coups. I thought I could, of course, I wrote something, but I did not use it somehow. I thought that we can draw an analogy between the coup of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and Pinochet in Chile. Of course, I don't mean an analogy between Allende and Morsi, but there is still, you have here an elected president for 1.5 years, situation of chaos, opposition that is not ready to make any compromise with the elected president. They are ready to cooperate with the army and even with the CIA. In Egypt, it wasn't the army and the CIA, it was the army and intelligence of Gulf countries, other countries, to reach, to isolate the president and his whole apparatus, and we can say even to control the media. And then to make this step of political coup by the leadership of the army. Usually, this kind of regimes, they sustain a little bit. I remember some in the Egyptian opposition were asking me after 2013, 3rd of July 2013, when are we going to get rid of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, or is it next Friday that the revolution will happen, or the Friday after that, etc. I usually used to disappoint them that usually this kind of regime, it will take time. It will take time because it's not young officers who are fighting among themselves like it was in the 50s, or the Ba'athi officers in Syria or in Iraq. It's the army itself. The army itself, meaning the leadership, the army with the whole apparatus. You can't face it by demonstrations, and you can't face it unless you want to go to weapons, and then you have a war, not a revolution anymore, a civil war like what happened in Syria. Let me come to this final idea. I believe that revolutions, democratic revolutions, cannot win unless, and I started with this idea, they are followed by a reform and an agreement or compromise, or call it even bargain, between the political elites concerning the shape of the regime after the revolution, agreeing on the principles of democracy, etc. In order to succeed in the first phase, you have to split the political establishment, to split the regime. You have to succeed to split the regime. One part of the regime should join the revolution, accept it, or at least be neutralized. The most important part is the army. If the army stays loyal to the regime and shoots at the people, people go home usually. You can't sustain peaceful demonstrations against an army. Or you take weapons and fight the army. This is what happened in Syria. And then you have, either you succeed because of balance of powers, or you have a kind of civil war. The art is how to neutralize the army, either by big demonstrations, huge demonstrations, or by addressing the interests and the ambitions of the army. In Iran, it wasn't the revolution and not addressing the ambitions of the army. In Iran, it happened because the regime was confused and lost the confidence of the army. It gave very contradictory orders a whole year. Once shoot, don't shoot, and then taking the people who shot to trials, they lost the army. And then the army joined the revolution. Without that, the Iranian revolution wouldn't have succeeded. So, the lesson is, for the future, for this phase, to pass this phase of revolution, the ruling elite should be split, the army should be addressed or neutralized by huge popular demonstrations that they cannot shoot at all. Of course, the times are we have hard times. But exactly these hard times are suitable for rethinking because, as I said, it's this round of democracy that failed. To be more specific, it's the political elites of the opposition and the regimes who failed in this phase. The young people who went to the streets against corruption and despotism and against humiliation and for human dignity did not vanish. They are there. And they are not fictitious. It's not a fiction. These are real people who really believed in that and who passed these barriers of fear. And they are there. And I really think that we can expect something from this generation in the near future. And when I talk and write, I write for that generation, to have new political elites from that generation who can reach a bargain, who can reach a compromise, who can accept to live with the other with disagreement according to rules of democracy. Having said that, astaghfirullah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.